Good evening. My name is Kai Bird. I'm the executive director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography. We're now in our 11th year of funding events like this, and our benefactor is sitting in the back of the room, Shelby White. We want to thank her for funding all of this. And among other things, besides these public events where we give a platform to biographers to talk about their new books, I just want to point out that we fund at least 4 fellowships a year for working biographers. And this year we have actually 5. Bruce Weber is working on E.L. Doctorow. Eleanor Randolph is working on Michael Bloomberg. Some of you people may remember him. Justin Gifford is doing Eldridge Cleaver, and Lindsay Whalen is working on the poet Mary Oliver, and Mickey Kaufman is working on a book on Henry Kissinger. So it's a really wide variety of subjects, and this is, I think, our last public event of this academic year, with the exception of, we have a 2-day conference on biography that's happening on May 19th and 20th, where we're co-sponsoring with BIO, an organization called Biographers International Organization. And it's going to be a terrific conference, just at the end of next week. You can sign up for it. You need to sign up if you do want to attend on their website. Just go to Biography International and you'll find it. And there are going to be many, many prominent biographers, including Edmund Morris, Richard Holmes, Stacy Schiff, and many others. Anyway, I'm delighted this evening to welcome Anshel Pfeffer to talk in conversation with Eric Alterman about his new biography, Bibi, The Turbulent Life and Times of Benjamin Netanyahu. This book is very timely. Alas, Israel is always in the news, so it's always timely, but I think he just got a review in the Times today, which was very good. And I guess our president is making news in the Middle East today as well by announcing his cancellation of the Iran deal. So this is obviously a very timely subject. Anshel Pfeffer was born in Manchester, England, but he's been reporting from Israel for 2 decades now, both for Haaretz and The Economist and other publications. But he lives in Jerusalem and has written really a quite extraordinary biography on a controversial Israeli prime minister. Eric Alterman is a CUNY Distinguished Professor of English and Journalism at Brooklyn College, the media columnist for The Nation, and I want to claim some personal credit for launching Eric's career, if only because I got him to publish his very first piece of journalism at The Nation back in the early 1980s. He's now published 10 books, too many to list here, but more relevant to this evening's topic, Eric is no stranger to controversy when it comes to Israel and the Middle East. I confess that while we don't always agree, I always let Eric vet anything I write about the Middle East. He keeps me honest on the subject. So, Eric, I turn the interrogation of Anshel over to you, and afterwards we'll have, I'm sure, 10 or 15 minutes for questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Kai. We'll have something to say about your introduction later. I just want to second what Kai said. I've read the book, and it's very impressive. And the most remarkable thing about the achievement of the book is that I don't think it really matters what you think about Israel and Israel-Palestine in order to learn from it and appreciate it, which is really something. I don't actually know how to do that myself. I saw, Anshel, a column you wrote recently in Haaretz. I guess it was kind of a promotional column for the book.
Shameless, I think I called it, yeah.
Yeah. And you said that you were surprised that you're one of the first biographers of Bibi Netanyahu. Why do you think that is, and also why do you think that's problematic?
Well, I'll start with the second part of your question.
Okay.
I think that a leader, as you said, we all have very different views and very contrasting views about Israel, about the Middle East, the conflict, and Netanyahu himself. But what we can't deny is that by now he's been on the public stage for nearly 4 decades, and if he holds on to office for another year, he'll be the longest-serving Prime Minister of Israel. And in addition to that, he's not just the Prime Minister of Israel. I think we can't deny that today he's one of the main figures on the global stage. He's the leader of a small country, but he's one of the most recognizable world leaders. He influences people like Donald Trump, but also leaders of other major countries like Modi of India. He has probably one of the best relationships of any world leaders with Vladimir Putin, all at the same time. And I think that you would expect such a leader to have had, if not a shelf full, but quite a few in-depth biographies by now. So far, there's only been one, before my book, one biography written originally in English and another one written originally in Hebrew and translated. I think there are a number of reasons why there are not more biographies. First of all, Israeli journalism, I think, everyone can judge it for themselves. A lot of Israeli journalism today is translated into English, not just my own newspaper, Haaretz, but a lot of other stuff written by Israeli journalists. But at the end of the day, we're serving a very small public. We're serving a Hebrew-speaking public. There are 8 to 9 million people living in Israel. Not all of them speak Hebrew. Writing a book is, as you know, not always a very cost-effective way of making a living. And certainly if your readership isn't very large. And at the same time, Israeli journalists work very hard every single day feeding the beast. We have almost every day another political crisis to deal with. So it doesn't really lend to introspection, to serious book writing. There are some very good books written on Israeli politics, but not as many as you would expect to be. So that's, I think, one main reason why we haven't seen yet that many biographies of Netanyahu. I know there are 2 or 3 at least new ones in the works, and everyone will be judged by his own merits. I think the second reason is that Netanyahu himself actively discourages biographies. He can't stop anyone from writing a biography, but he won't cooperate with anyone who's writing a biography. And he said to me a number of times over the last few years, he never met me for a formal interview for the biography. He refused to do so. But we met at various briefings and meetings in other contexts, and he always had a barbed comment. From the moment he heard I was writing a biography, and I did approach him both formally and informally to try and get his cooperation. I didn't expect to get it, and I wasn't disappointed. But he did say to me every time he met me, "You don't know anything about me, and your book will be a cartoon." And it almost became a standing joke every time he saw me. The last time he saw me, he said to me, "Well, is your book ready?" I said, "Yeah, I handed in the manuscript. The book's coming out in May. You can buy it for $30. And to which he said immediately, "What, you expect me to pay?" So I said, "Whoever cooperated is going to get a free copy." To which some of the people in the room kind of tried to hide their smile because various people had cooperated and didn't want Netanyahu to know about it. So he actively discourages it. Netanyahu is a historian's son, and he has a very, very well-developed, probably an exaggerated sense of his own place in history, and he wants to be the person to define that place in history. And this last time I met him, with some other journalists in the room, one of them asked him a question to which he said, "I'm keeping the answer to that for my memoirs, which I will write in many, many years from now." He wants to be the person not just to build Israel in his own image, but also to build his own narrative and history. And it's not easy to write a biography about someone who won't help and who discourages it. On the other hand, there are a lot of people who talk to you when you're writing about Netanyahu. So it wasn't as difficult as all that to find a lot of source material.
This is a quick question, but I've noticed.
I'm not audible.
You can have my mic.
It's fine? So, maybe okay, so let's just put it here. I'm sure it'll be okay.
I think you just speak into the...
Okay, I'll try to speak up anyway.
Would you mind repeating your answer? Jews are
was
such
the
funny
question?
people. This is a quick question. I've noticed lately that Israeli writers are writing in English, not in Hebrew. And I assume this book has not been written in Hebrew.
No, well, English is my mother tongue. I wrote it in English,
Okay,
and
so in your
partly
case,
because you know I wanted a bigger audience.
But were you worried about censorship?
No, I wasn't worried about censorship. I didn't delve into too many operational details because also the book is 400 pages. It tries to encompass a period which begins with the birth of Zionism and the birth of Netanyahu's grandfather. There are various things I'd like to have written about which I knew the censorship would not allow me to write about.
Right. This is going to be a later question, but I'll put it in here since we're talking about it. So there was a period in Bibi's life where he served in Malka?
Sayeret Matkal.
Yeah. So those are like the assassination type groups, and everything they do is highly classified. And you basically nobody knows what he did then. He's never talked about it. And I guess none of the people who served with him have talked about it.
Well, interestingly, there's a book out, I think
By
almost
Ronan
today,
Bergman's
by
book.
Ehud Barak.
Oh, really?
Ehud Barak's autobiography appeared, I think, yesterday here in the US. And Ehud Barak, for the first time, gives interesting, actual operational details of the missions, because Ehud Barak was Netanyahu's commander in the unit. Oh. And a lot of the things which Netanyahu was doing at the time, which still can't be told because A, they're not known except by a very small group of people, and B, since I am an Israeli citizen and I work in Israel, I know that censorship won't allow me to say these things. Barak, for the first time, gives some of the details. What Netanyahu's unit was doing was mainly working behind enemy lines, deep inside Syria, deep inside Egypt at the time, and burying under the ground listening devices. Oh. That's the core mission of the unit. It's now finally out. Netanyahu was first as a soldier on these missions, then as an officer. He led at least 2 of these missions, and these are missions which take many months to prepare. One mission for which he's fabled almost within the unit was done at some very high point in the snow on the Golan. That's all we know.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's roll back then. A very important theme in your book is the complicated identity of Bibi as simultaneously American and Israeli, but also not quite either one exactly. Certainly, well, anyway, I'll let you try and explain it.
Well, Netanyahu was born in 1949, and he was from birth a citizen of both countries. His mother is originally from Cleveland, and he, like many Israelis, like myself, had two passports. He had to relinquish his U.S. citizenship when he became, as all diplomats have to do. He had to then give up his U.S. citizenship, but he is from birth a dual citizen. However, I think that despite, and this is something which I explore quite extensively in the book, I think despite Netanyahu's American image, he's not an American. He learned how to speak American. He learned how to perform. He learned how to be on television here in the U.S. in the 1980s. But it's much more of a tool than a real part of his identity. His identity is of an Israeli nationalist. His history, his outlook is very much built by Jewish history. And I think the American part of his character has a lot to do with how he sees economics. He's a major capitalist. And I think it forms the way he sees the world in the sense of the West against everyone else. And he sees Israel as being an outpost of the West, but I don't think he sees himself as American.
I'm glad to hear that he gave up his passport because I was worried that the Republicans would run him in the next election. I'm serious.
He's not U.S. born, so he can't run for president.
Oh, okay, good. But neither was Obama. It's a joke. It's just a joke. Talk about his father and how influential you think his father has been in forming his politics and the way he sees the world?
Well, I think like almost every father-son relationship, there are the bits where the father forms and informs the son, and there's also the place where the son rebels. And I think we see them both with Netanyahu. The rebellion is something he's tried to hide over the years, but we can find it between the lines, both of the letters that his brother wrote and also the circumstances of how he returned to Israel. So Netanyahu hasn't spoken very much about his childhood over the years. He gave one very interesting interview to a very friendly interviewer a couple of years ago, in which he spoke about how their parents told them when they were young boys in Jerusalem. He was born in Tel Aviv, but they moved to Jerusalem when he was 1. How they were told that they were moving to the US. His father was a brilliant academic, very controversial historian, couldn't find his place in Israeli academia, which was then quite small, and has always been, Israeli academia has always never had enough posts for a lot of brilliant people there. Like many Israeli academics, he came to the US to work. And Netanyahu, I think the only time Netanyahu has ever really opened up to a childhood trauma was when he said that when my parents came and told me at the age of 12 that we're moving back to the US, they spent a couple of years here when he was 9, here in New York and then another year in Long Island. And that was a very traumatic period. He remembers very vividly sitting in a school here and not speaking the language and having basically being treated like an idiot, though we all know he's a very bright person. That was a very traumatic experience for him when he was 9 and 10. And when he was told once again at the age of 12 that they're moving back to the US, he says it was a terrible dislocation. And he blamed his father for that. There's no question. And his father was a Zionist, was a very staunch Zionist, but he saw Zionism and he saw his own role and his son's role in Zionism in a rather old-fashioned way. He saw them as being ideologues. He saw them as being intellectuals. He didn't think that it was necessary for them to serve in the military, which for his sons, for Yoni Netanyahu, his elder son, and for Bibi was a central part of their aspirations as boys and then as young men. And when they moved here and they lived in Philadelphia, he put incredible pressure on them to excel at the high school, which they both did. And Netanyahu was an honors student in high school. Very quickly made up all whatever deficiency he still had in English, and you see the result today whenever he's on television. His English is fantastic. And Yoni was accepted to Harvard and Bibi was accepted to Yale. But they both deferred their studies and they both returned to Israel to serve in the army. And this was in direct rebellion to their dad, to the Professor Ben-Zion Netanyahu, who said to them, why do you have to go and be grunts in the army? He didn't see any value in them serving in the army. Other people could be in the army. His sons were destined in his vision to be part of the intellectual elite. And the father didn't understand what his sons were doing in the army. He didn't understand that they were both in the most elite of Israeli units, and basically until Yoni was killed in 1976. And only when he returned back to Israel from Cornell for Yoni's Shiva and for the period of mourning after Yoni's death, and the senior officers of the Israeli military came to console them in their mourning period. And for the first time, he was exposed to what his sons had been doing. Not really, he wasn't given major operational details, but the first time he understood that what his sons were doing basically placed them within the Israeli elite. And he had thought that to be part of the Israeli elite, they need to study in Harvard and Yale and return to Israel at a much later age when they've already done PhDs and so on. And that was the rebellion of the Netanyahu sons. They never spoke of it in public about how they rebelled against their father. But for them, going back to the Israeli army was a major act of rebellion. And they were both returned on their own. The parents stayed in the US.
One thing I've always thought about, though, was that Ben-Zion Netanyahu was a historian of anti-Semitism. He spent his whole life really on, I think, really one book. And in that book, he argues that there's just nothing to be done, that it's just a fact of life. Every enemy of the Jews is an enemy of the Jews because people hate Jews. There's nothing Jews can do except continually fight anti-Semitism. In other words, there's no difference between Hitler and Arafat, etc. and therefore all they understand is strength, whoever the enemy is. So there was some hope for a while that once his father died, it might free Bibi from this hardline attitude he had taken and allow him to evolve the way, say, Ariel Sharon appeared to have evolved before he had his stroke. I'm wondering if you think that Bibi's relationship with his father would make that impossible, or if it's just he happens to believe it, and he would believe it with or without his father.
No, I think that I think that Netanyahu hasn't evolved. I think if you read his own book, which was published last month, 25 years ago in English first, and interestingly, in the acknowledgement, he doesn't mention his father. It says a last act of defiance. But if you actually read the book, it's very much his own father's historical theory, whereby anti-Semitism going back, and his father was an expert mainly on the Spanish Inquisition and the Spanish expulsion of Jews in 1492. That was his father's main field of expertise. Ben-Zion saw a direct line connecting the Spanish Inquisition and expulsion all the way to the Holocaust and further on. And if you read Netanyahu's book, it's the same thing. He believes that every step of the way the Jews are facing incredible hatred and incredible threat, and you don't evolve it if that's the way you look at things. You have to always be on guard, always alert for the next threat, and never to concede.
So if history is a battle between the Jews and the threats they face, and Israel is the fortress that defends the Jews, what is the role for the Arabs? The Arabs who make up almost 20% of the state of Israel, and the Arabs under occupation in the West Bank, and to a lesser, I imagine he'd be willing to get rid of Gaza, but he wants to keep the West Bank forever. And certainly you've got almost 1 out of every 5 Israelis who are not Jews. To what degree does he see them as human with natural rights and political rights?
Well, Netanyahu's view of history doesn't just see the Jews as being, or Israel as being a fortress surrounded by enemies. He's also very much a Western values kind of guy. You know, kind of the clash of civilizations view of the world. And he sees Israel not just as being a fortress, as being also the outpost of Western values. So his worldview is that Israel is being attacked by the West because the West doesn't realize that Israel is the West. Israel is the West bastion of values in the Middle East. And he writes, and he said in many speeches, that the hatred towards Israel is a hatred towards Western values, not just towards Jews. So when he looks at the Palestinians, he doesn't see a distinct nation. He doesn't see 5 million Palestinians living in Gaza on the West Bank and within Israel. He sees them as part of 300 million Arabs who Israel is on the front lines against. So, and every time you have a frank conversation with Netanyahu and you bring up the Palestinians, he'll say something very dismissive like, don't go down that rabbit hole. That's a sideshow. He'll say, it's a sideshow. Don't talk with me about the Palestinians. They're not a real issue. The real issue is us versus the Arabs, us versus extreme Islam. The Palestinians are a diversion from that issue. And you can see over the years how Netanyahu has always tried to focus on a much bigger enemy. At the beginning of his career, when the USSR was still there, his main enemy, or the main enemy he conjured up in his speeches, was the USSR and radical Arab regimes working together. Then in the early 90s, the Soviet Union dissolved and it became Iraq for a while. 2003, the Iraq War, Iraq was no longer a threat. Then Iran came along. So all the time he's seen a big threat within Islam, within the Arab world, and the Palestinians as being a bit of a side issue. And now we're seeing the most interesting development in Netanyahu's ideology. 20 years ago, Netanyahu would have spoken about the Saudis, not just Netanyahu, AIPAC or any other pro-Israel group would have spoken about the Saudis in the same vein as today they speak about Iran, because the Saudis were they were the ones who were sponsoring all the Palestinian groups. They were sponsoring other terror groups. As we know here in New York, they sponsored Al-Qaeda for a long period. Now the Saudis are all of a sudden Israel's allies because Iran is the big enemy. So Netanyahu's ideology hasn't changed. There always has to be a big Islamic enemy, but the allies can change. So all of a sudden, the Saudis are coming round to Netanyahu's view. They're kind of leaving the Palestinians. The Palestinians have never been so marginalized for 30 years.
Yeah.
And Netanyahu's view seems to be working, at least for now.
So this is, I agree with this, although I hadn't thought about it before, but if Israel is a bastion of the West, then what is the role of Arab Jews?
Sorry?
What about all the Jews who come from Arab countries who are not Western?
Well, Netanyahu it has a very nuanced position. On the one hand, you're talking about the people who are his voters,
Yeah.
who are Likud voters. On the other hand, Netanyahu is an elitist Ashkenazi. And Netanyahu has succeeded in an incredible sleight of hand to make himself, at the same time, this elitist statesman, intellectual, etc., and on the other hand, to make the constituency of Jews who came from Arab countries feel that Netanyahu is in some way their champion. And that's Netanyahu's a coalition builder. But usually when we say coalition builder in politics, we mean someone who unifies people, brings people together, makes them feel good with each other, heals the rifts in society. Netanyahu's built coalitions on exactly the opposite. He's built coalitions on finding the resentments and the bitterness of every section in his constituency, in his base, and playing these things up. He doesn't bring his coalition together. He makes common cause within his coalition against the common enemy. The common enemy in that context is the left wing, the elitists, people like him basically, but he won't identify in public with people like him.
Where do you think he learned that?
It's a good question. Where did Donald Trump learn that? When everyone asks me, what did Donald Trump and that may be one of the next questions.
Yeah.
But
I'll do this if you don't mind.
but I'm sorry for preempting one of your questions. The question everyone asks here is, what did Bibi and Trump have in common? And there is an uncanny ability which they both have, and they're very different people. And when you ask the question, I'll expand on that. But this dark gift, it's a gift for a politician, but it's a terrible thing, to seek out the phobias, to seek out the fears, to play them up. I don't know where he got it, but he has it.
Okay. I want to roll back a little bit. Two surprising things I learned from your book early on. One is that those of us who paid attention have always thought that Bibi idolized Yoni and that it was his brother who was killed in the Entebbe raid, the only person who was killed in that raid, and that he it's kind of like, Bibi was more Fredo and Yoni was what's his name, Al Pacino, but you seem
you can do it from The Godfather, or people who like Tolkien, it's Boromir and Faramir. There's different. It depends what your cultural context is.
In any case, you're sort of a revisionist on. You're not sort of. You are a revisionist on Yoni, and the Yoni that you write about is not nearly so impressive. And a great myth has been constructed about Yoni, in significant measure by Bibi and his family, but also serving the state of Israel. And I wonder if that tells us anything about Bibi that we need to know.
Well, 24,000 Israeli soldiers have been killed over the last 70 years. It's a big number. Other countries have lost more soldiers in wars, but it's a big number for a small country. Not one soldier has received the amount of commemoration, and Israel spends a lot of resources on commemorating its dead soldiers, as do many countries. But Israel has a special, some would say fetish, some would say ethos of commemorating its dead soldiers. Israel does not lack for military heroes, but Yoni is like no other. And some of those reasons are objective, nothing to do with the Netanyahu family. The Entebbe raid was 1976, it's 3 years after the Yom Kippur War. Yom Kippur War was and remains Israel's biggest military trauma, when Israel was caught unprepared by Egypt and Syria. More than 2,000 soldiers were killed. Israel ultimately won that war, but it's remembered as an intelligence failure, as a period of deep many recriminations. The high command of the army, and ultimately also Golda and Moshe Dayan, had to resign. Then along came 1976 in Entebbe, and that was a great victory. And it was an incredible operation, and special operations, special forces around the world still learn Entebbe as a textbook of how to carry out a hostage rescue operation. And one soldier was killed, like you said. There were 3 hostages were killed, and the terrorists were killed as well. But this was an incredible victory coming at the period when Israel needed it the most. The public, the Israeli public needs to believe in the military. And 1973 was a period of, October 1973, the Yom Kippur War was a terrible trauma. So Entebbe came just at the right moment. And since it was carried out by special forces whose names and units can't be identified, but one man died, then that man could suddenly personify the entire operation. And the operation was originally called Operation Thunderbolt. It was renamed Operation Jonathan after Yoni Netanyahu. So the one man symbolized this wonderful miracle of the Israeli military's deliverance of Israeli citizens from darkest or deepest Africa, bringing them back to Israel on the wings of eagle. It was everything. I mean, so many films, so many movies have been made about the Entebbe raid. It's made for Hollywood, and Yoni personified all that. And suddenly, the family also has to fill in, because Yoni can't speak, and Yoni's comrades can't speak because they're still involved in secret operations. Who's there? There's Bibi, Yoni's brother, who was also in that unit, but by then he was no longer a career officer. Bibi was the stand-in. So all of a sudden, Bibi Netanyahu was delivered an incredible platform. And there was also a political fight between Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin over who gets more credit, so they all wanted to be friends with Bibi. Shimon Peres, who afterwards was beaten by Netanyahu a number of times politically, was the man who first made Bibi Netanyahu into a public figure. So all these things rely on Yoni being a wonderful hero. But Yoni was a human being. He was an impressive young man. He was a serious officer. He was also suffering from PTSD following the Yom Kippur War. He wasn't doing very well in his new position as commander of Seret Matkal of the unit. He was probably on the verge or on the eve of being relieved of command, which would have been a terrible thing. But sometimes it happens in military units. You need a lot of different qualities to lead, and if he was a 30-year-old officer suffering from PTSD, and he probably needed treatment and not to be in charge of that unit. Instead of being relieved of his command, he got killed in line of duty and became a hero. So that's the revisionism that needs to be done. But I didn't do it. I mean, I write about it in the book. It was done already by a number of officers from that unit who felt that the Netanyahu family is stealing their glory for Bibi's political purposes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Another thing that's a little bit surprising in your book, although it maybe shouldn't be, is Bibi's fondness for Ayn Rand, which I just didn't know, but it makes perfect sense. It set off a question in my mind. I know that his father always felt incredibly misused or abused by the labor Zionist establishment in academia and so forth. And there's definitely a feeling, Bibi's not alone in this, but a real venomous hatred for the original labor Zionist founders, the generation that kept power from the beginning of the state through 77. I'm wondering to what degree you think he's just philosophically opposed to socialism because he was a capitalist who went to business school here and he loved Ayn Rand, or he's carrying on this vendetta that his father felt on behalf of his father, and how his father felt that he was abused by these people, and that's why he had to go to America, because he couldn't get a good job in Israel.
To be honest, I don't think Netanyahu is carrying on his father's vendetta. I think that it's much more a matter of political expediency. It works, as I said before, the coalition that Netanyahu has built is a coalition of outsiders, of underdogs, of people who, even though today they make up the Israeli establishment in many ways, still feel that they're outside the establishment, still feel that they're being screwed over by the old socialist Zionists, who do, even though they're not in political power, still dominate Israeli culture and Israeli media and parts of the Israeli economy. So the feeling of resentment which his father felt is a much wider feeling. His father had lacked nothing. His father got great jobs in American academia. He had a very good job in Israel. He was officially the editor of the biggest Israeli encyclopedia. It was a very successful commercial venture. He made lots of money at the time. He didn't get what he wanted. He wanted to be a professor at the Hebrew University, and he never forgave them for not getting that specific job. But the vendetta of his father, I think, has long ago ceased to play a major role. It just works for him.
Okay. Another thing Bibi has in common with President Trump, it's hard to say, is that the religious people really love him, even though he behaves in such a way that ought to offend them. And I'm wondering if there's a story where he eats bacon and eggs in public to show... At the Regency. This is about American Jews, and that's my next question, so don't speak to that in this question. But talk a little bit about his relationship with the Haredi. Is it entirely cynical on all sides, or is there something... has he learned to show respect for them in a way that they appreciate?
Well, yes, first of all, he does know how to show respect, and he began his journey to the heart of the ultra-Orthodox, of the Haredi community, following another very secular and actually very American saga, which is his famous sex tape, which actually never existed, but he thought it existed, and therefore he went on television in 1993 and admitted to having had an affair. Netanyahu is the most secular of Israeli prime ministers, probably. He's been married 3 times. Some of his affairs have been reported. Like you say, he eats bacon and eggs, or as one of his former religious aides said, he eats cheeseburgers on Tisha B'Av. He doesn't keep he doesn't keep personally any mitzvah in the Torah, but he may not share the values of the religious community, so he shares interests with them. And their interests are the interests of being groups which feel that they were shut out of the establishment early on in the state, and they're anxious to keep their hold now on power, on state budgets, on ministries, and together with and Netanyahu's strongest political bonds are with the Haredi community. They still see him as their champion, and they're very cynical. They're more cynical than he is because they know very well what he is. They don't expect him to be to be religious. They don't expect him to lead a virtuous life. They expect him to take care of their interests.
It sounds like our evangelicals went over to Israel and learned how to do it, and now they've brought it back.
I think that in American politics, you're now replaying what we've seen for 20 years in Israeli politics.
Talk now about Bibi's relationship with the American Jewish establishment.
It's a very one-sided relationship. Netanyahu, I began by saying that Netanyahu was born a U.S. citizen. He was never an American Jew. Yes, he's an American. He talks like an American. He thinks in many ways politically, and he can financially like an American. But he doesn't feel an affinity to American Jews. If anything, he's always been very dismissive of them. He's always seen them as soft, weak, lacking in any kind of real ideology. He's someone who went and fought in wars and risked his life and was almost killed on a number of operations. And he sees American Jews as being this almost superfluous part of the Jewish people. They're useful for him at a time to support him politically, to donate to his campaigns. Sheldon Adelson set up a whole newspaper for Netanyahu. But recently, Netanyahu has actually been saying, not in public, but he's been saying in discussions with his staff, with people who are close to him, that he could do without American Jews. He's got the evangelicals, he's got the GOP. Israel's doing very well financially, it's got lots of money, the Israeli GDP is going up and up. He's got friends in India, he's got friends in Russia, the Chinese want to do business with him. Netanyahu said recently in a private conversation that he would quite happily give up on AIPAC and on J Street. If there wasn't this argument, if there wasn't all these liberal left-wing Jews trying to influence the administration to take a stronger line on Israel, he'd be quite happy to give up on AIPAC as well. Now, on the other side, American Jews always felt that he's one of them because he's an Israeli, but he speaks an American. they have the image of Netanyahu as being one of them, but he's certainly not an American Jew, never has been.
Okay, I'm going to say words that have maybe never been said in this room, and I apologize. Who the fuck does he think he is? Who's the fucking superpower here? That's Bill Clinton talking about Bibi Netanyahu. Talk about Bibi's relationship with American presidents.
So a minute ago I said he's not an American Jew, but he does think that he knows and understands and in many ways embodies American history and values just as much as some of the American presidents, perhaps not as Bill Clinton, but certainly as the previous occupant of the White House. And there's a very famous scene in one of the joint statements by Netanyahu and Barack Obama, where it looks like Netanyahu is lecturing Obama. And I think in some way, Bibi thinks that he can lecture many Americans, that he understands America better than them. Bibi spends a lot of his time reading, and he mainly reads American history and American biographies. This is the Biography Center. Bibi is an avid reader of biographies. I was just told this morning that he's read the book, but he hasn't yet told me what he thinks about it. He's a voracious reader of history, especially American history. He knows it very well. You can argue about whether the conclusions there and the lessons he's drawn from America's history are the right ones to draw, but he does believe that if he had lived, been born, and been an American citizen, he could have been the U.S. president. And he's constantly being told by Republican supporters, if only you were born in the U.S., you would be our president. Okay. And actually, some very serious American journalists said to me, yes, we do think if Netanyahu had been an American, we would have been presidential material.
Okay. I've got two more questions, so get your questions ready if you've got them. One of the things I personally have found most offensive in recent times about Bibi is what I see as his willingness to exploit anti-Semitism, particularly with his comments about George Soros, and given the threats that Jews face, and Soros being the symbol of those threats in Europe in particular, but also as a symbol here in the far right, among the far right. I wonder if you want to talk about what Soros, is it entirely cynical, or is that kind of Jew something that Bibi wants to demonize?
No, it's not cynical. Bibi sees both American Jews and Jews in any other diaspora, any other country in Europe or around the world, as if you're on our side, if you share our vision and our policies in Israel, then you're good Jews, you're on our side, you're within the camp, and if you're not, then I'm not interested in you, and I will make alliances with your governments or your oppositions according to my own needs. And so we saw the way that Bibi came here 3 years ago and addressed Congress, and I think the great majority of American Jews were distressed by the fact that he was in such an open way opposing the Obama administration. And it's important to remember, Barack Obama is the politician in the world in history who's received more Jewish votes than any other. 3 million Jews in 2008 voted for Barack Obama. Bibi got the most, 1 million Israeli votes. So you could argue that Barack Obama is the leader of the Jew. He's not Jewish, but you could argue that there is no politician.
He does call himself a liberal Jew.
He does, yeah.
Yes.
And in many ways, he embodies a certain type of Jewish value, Barack Obama. And he is the one politician in the world to have received the largest number of Jewish votes ever. But Netanyahu, before he came to make that address to Congress in 2015, said, I am going as representative of the Jewish people, not just, he specifically said, not just of Israel. And he does have a claim, as the elected leader of Israel, to be safeguarding the Jewish haven. Israel's raison d'etre is to be a haven. Hopefully, the Jews of the world will never need that haven, but that is the reason, one of the main reasons Israel exists, to be that place where Jews can come if they will ever need to. So he has a valid claim to that. And I think that we're going to carry on seeing this kind of clash where he said, I think that it's in Israel's interest, Benjamin Netanyahu, think it's, for example, to be close to Viktor Orban of Hungary, who you mentioned Soros. Viktor Orban is the prime minister of Hungary, who's been running a not overtly, but very borderline, with lots of dog whistle, anti-Semitic tones, anti-George Soros campaign. The same goes for the government of Poland, which is now legislating Holocaust revisionism laws. But Netanyahu wants to be close to Poland because Poland is a major member of the European Union, and he wants influence within the EU. France and Germany are not very pro-Bibi. They may be pro-Israel, but they're not pro-Bibi. So he has Hungary, and he has Poland, and he has the Czech Republic, all these Central or East European countries where anti-Semitism is still part of daily politics. Bibi gets close to them. Another EU member, Austria, now a government with a major, maybe they're not neo-Nazis anymore, but the Freedom Party, many of their members were not that long ago openly neo-Nazi. Bibi is Kurtz's best friend. Sebastian Kurz, the chancellor, he immediately called and congratulated. And after Kurz won the election, even though it was clear that Kurz was going to bring the Freedom Party into the coalition. And of course, Bibi's silence whenever Donald Trump says or doesn't say something about white supremacists. Mm-hmm. You will never hear a word of criticism from Netanyahu about this thing. And this is overturning Israeli policy until very recently. Israeli policy always was that a Jewish community anywhere in the world gets to decide for itself the relationship with various suspect leaders and parties. And Israel will not second guess the Jewish community regarding who we talk to. The best example is in France, the Jewish community does not speak to the National Front, the Front National. And that is the policy of Israel as well. It may change, but we saw it, and let's try to close this issue. 2 years ago, the Hungarian Jewish community asked Israel to condemn various things being done, including the anti-Soros campaign. And Netanyahu basically said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to carry on being friends with Orban. And he even issued a statement in which he almost endorsed Orban's campaign against Soros. And that's a major break in the contract, the unwritten contract between Israel and the Jews of the world.
My final question is, tell us what's going to happen with the corruption probe, and will Bibi survive, and if he doesn't, what will happen?
Well, the corruption probe is like any other white-collar crime investigation. How do you prove that someone took a bribe if it's not actually brown envelope stuff with cash? So Netanyahu did things, did various favors perhaps for media owners. Those media owners perhaps in return gave him favorable coverage in their news organizations. Can you prove that? That's a big question. We've seen over the last 10 years that Israel sent to prison both a president and a prime minister, Moshe Katsav and Ehud Olmert. So the Israeli law enforcement establishment is strong enough to send Bibi to prison. On the other hand, we've seen how other politicians like Arik Sharon, who was just as corrupt, perhaps even more than Ehud Olmert and Netanyahu perhaps, and Avigdor Lieberman, we both saw them beating the rap on their investigations. I'd say it's 50-50.
How would you say Israelis see it?
50-50.
Yeah, okay.
Half of Israelis are convinced Netanyahu's a corrupt bastard who has to go to prison, and half of them are saying the police are just out to get him.
And yet, my last comment, and maybe you don't have to speak to it, but you can if you want. Israel doesn't seem divided the way the United States is divided by Trump. Bibi is not that divisive a figure. He's somehow a uniting figure, and the left is isolated and lonely and pathetic.
Well, when you say the word "the left" in Israel, are you talking about? Usually, we're talking about the center.
What used to be the peace camp.
But what is the peace camp? In peace camp in Israel, do you want a two-state solution? 60% of Israelis want a two-state solution. 60% of Israelis don't believe a two-state solution is possible. 60% of Israelis would be in favor of a two-state solution if Bibi tomorrow would support it. They were in favor when suddenly Arik Sharon flipped over, as you said, evolved. When Ehud Olmert was planning to do it, they were in favor. So the left or the peace camp or the center in Israel is a very amorphous concept.
Okay. I'll you want to recognize people? Okay.
Thank you. That was fascinating. I'm going to lead off with my own lead question, and then we'll get questions from the audience. I'm wondering about Iran. Is Netanyahu willing to throw the dice on Iran, have a war, and gamble that the chaos that comes after such a war would be in Israel's interest?
Well, Netanyahu today did basically throw the dice, because what we heard, any of us who were watching or listening to Donald Trump speak today at 2 p.m., we heard Bibi. For the first time, I think in the history of the U.S.-Israel relationship, and we're talking about two countries which are strategic, eyes have always been close, but for the first time, a U.S. president basically expressed what is Israel's doctrine. Trump's announcement could not have been written better by Netanyahu. Word for word. There was not one word that Netanyahu would not have signed off on. And, okay, Trump has his own motive because he wants to obliterate every remaining shred of Barack Obama's legacy. There's that. There is an anti-Iran, a major anti-Iran faction within the Republican Party. But Netanyahu, certainly his influences, you could see it there. So, people say that Netanyahu dictates stuff. He didn't dictate anything to Trump. Trump was very happy to do this, but Bibi's influence was certainly very discernible there. So what we've seen today has been a throwing of the dice. So we're now in uncharted territory. The JCPOA may be lost, probably is lost. We don't know what's going to happen next. Where I would qualify that is Netanyahu does not want a war with Iran. Netanyahu is not a warmonger, despite his very thuggish, perhaps, image. Netanyahu does not like war. Netanyahu doesn't believe in having... First of all, Netanyahu, I commissioned some data analysis for this book. Netanyahu has got the lowest casualty rate of any Israeli prime minister. And you would think that Shimon Peres or Rabin would have. No, Netanyahu has had less serious violence on his watch than any Israeli prime minister because he's risk averse. He doesn't want big wars. He doesn't want to make peace either. He won't take risks for making peace, but he doesn't want a war with Iran. The guy who wanted the war with Iran was Ehud Barak, his defense minister at the time. Bibi always wants to be seen as being prepared to go to war. He believes that will help him to get a much better deal from Iran, and we'll see in the next few months if that's right or wrong.
Questions?
I first noticed Bibi Netanyahu in 1991 when he was on CNN all the time during the Gulf War. Was that as important a moment as it seemed to me in terms of his career?
Should we take a few, or should I answer everyone? How do you want to do it?
Oh, why don't you take one?
Okay, so I actually have in the book the photograph of him sitting there in the CNN studio with the gas mask, and he was waiting for that moment, because anybody who was in Israel at the time, or anyone who remembers that period, you couldn't know when he would suddenly be caught with a missile alert of incoming Iraqi missiles. And even though none of the missiles had gas on them, that was the main worry. So all Israelis were given the order to put on gas masks whenever there was an incoming missile. And Bibi was going around all those studios, CNN and every other studio you can think of, with a gas mask with him. He actually obtained, because the standard issue gas masks had the filter over your mouth, so you couldn't really talk with it. Bibi managed to find a gas mask with the filter on the side, which kind of would have allowed him to talk. And he was waiting for that moment, which everyone remembers. He'd given so many interviews. He was waiting for the moment for the interview to happen exactly when there was an incoming, and that happened then. Was it a big moment in his career? I think it was more of an iconic moment, which kind of showed how he'd already developed into this very polished performer on television. Netanyahu came of age as a politician at the same time as cable news. He was one of the very first Israeli diplomats to go to Atlanta to CNN headquarters and see this new thing of rolling coverage. And he knew how to deal with it already before 1991, before the Gulf War. So it was a moment which I don't think moved his career on, but it certainly symbolized all he'd been trying to do.
Thank you for your presentation. What was Netanyahu's reaction when Obama allowed the UN vote to censor Israel by not abstaining, basically throwing Israel under the bus. How did Netanyahu react to that?
Well, in public, he scandalized. This is the administration is betraying us and so on. But Netanyahu has been at the UN. He was the ambassador to the UN. That was what made his career more than anything else. And I think he's very much aware that a UN resolution means nothing. You know, it's a headline, but it doesn't change anything on the ground, unless there's actual sanctions or anything involved, but 99% of the resolutions don't really mean anything. It was, for him, a way of portraying Obama, like you said, as someone who threw Israel under the bus. Obama did not throw Israel under the bus. Obama was a fantastic president for Israel, in my opinion. He gave Israel more aid than any previous president. He forgave Netanyahu. Obama did a lot of things that the Senate didn't even know about, including intelligence. Look, I was a military correspondent at the time for Haaretz. Israel was getting unprecedented support and aid and cooperation from the U.S. intelligence community, from the U.S. military, from the U.S. defense industry under Obama. He did not, in my opinion, there is no way you could prove that Obama threw Israel under the bus. But you're welcome to disagree.
I hear that quite a few African Jews are being expelled. Is Israel a democratic country still?
I think you're slightly mistaken. They're not African Jews, they're African migrants. And as to the question of whether Israel is still a democracy, I would answer that Israel is a democracy within the Green Line or the pre-1967 border, where everyone has a vote and governments can be
Even
voted in
Arabs?
and out. Sorry?
Even Arabs vote?
Yeah, 20% of Israeli citizens are Arabs, and they have a vote, and they represent.
But isn't the ultra-Orthodox party against Arabs voting?
No, the ultra-Orthodox party are not against Arabs voting. Actually, there's no party against Arabs voting today in Israel. There are various attacks on the High Court, on the media, as in any country where democracy currently is struggling. Where Israel is not a democracy is in the West Bank, where Israel still controls the lives of Palestinians who do not have a vote. But within the original borders of Israel, the borders which existed from 48 till 67, Israel still is a democracy. Yeah, it's a struggling democracy, like many democracies today are struggling, but it still is a democracy.
Thank you.
Thank you. A comment and a question. I would agree entirely with your assessment of how Israel benefited under Obama's regime. I mean, the intelligence that we shared, the aid was phenomenal. I think what turned Netanyahu against him was that first speech from Cairo. And in my mind, you can't do anything unless you open a dialogue, and he was trying to open a dialogue. The question is, what part does he have in selecting the inane graphics that he uses? Like the bomb that he did at the UN, that stupid old bomb, and even last week with the 40 CDs saying, we have all this information, which, by the way, has not been corroborated anywhere. We have all this information, putting up a display of 40 CDs. Who does he think he's appealing to with this?
Well, the Bibi show has been going on ever since Bibi became a diplomat. And these visual aids is something he started doing here in New York when he was the ambassador to the UN. One of the earliest things he did was when Lebanon was trying to get the Security Council to condemn Israel for bombing some target inside Lebanon. He had the secretary at the embassy here in the embassy to the UN here in New York trying to call up Lebanon on the phone. And the video shows the secretary calling, and the operators can't get aligned into Lebanon. Lebanon, of course, at the time, was undergoing a civil war. And Bibi used that to show, how can Lebanon even call to condemn it? Lebanon's not even it's not even a functioning country. Israel has to be operating there to safeguard Israel's security. And Bibi's always loved these visual aids. You and I and many people may see these cartoons as inane, as ridiculous. They work on a lot of levels. Many people see these things and are convinced or impressed. Bibi is, he's a very clever, he's an intellectual person, but he's also very good at working audiences on many different levels, and he's probably not trying to appeal to you when he does these things, or to me.
Thank you.
I'm intrigued by the political party structure in Israel, which requires any government to depend on small parties for their very few votes. Otherwise, the government would fail. And so I'm also intrigued by news reports that at times Bibi has tried to make a coalition with the Labor Party, or what is now called the Zionist Union, and the Zionist Union under Herzog refused. Why? He did make a coalition with Yesh Atid,
Yeah.
and then the leader, whose name I forget for the moment, withdrew from the government after I don't know how long. So could you please explain the workings of these coalitions in Israeli politics, and in particular why the Zionist Union reformed to enter a coalition?
Well, Israel's a parliamentary democracy, which is the opposite of what you have here in the U.S., in the sense that Netanyahu does not have a personal mandate. He's not. There was a short experiment with personal elections. It didn't go very well. It was the first time Netanyahu was elected, actually. But the idea upon which the parliamentary democracy is based is that there are so many different communities in Israel. In order to give each one of these communities some kind of a voice in politics and in public life, therefore the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, is built on small parties, and the electoral threshold is low. Now, for many years, there's been an argument of how low should the electoral threshold be. In other words, if the threshold is very low, that means you'll have lots of very small parties. And they were saying for many years we should bring the electoral threshold up to allow more stability and less small parties, in which every small party has a bit of a blackmail power over the government. Recently, they brought it up to 4%, and when that happened, they were saying, actually, this is not good because this is going to marginalize or even keep out of politics the Arab community, because the Arab community had 3 small parties which wouldn't have got in with a 4% threshold. The reason I'm bringing all these numbers in, and this arithmetic, is that in order to make Israeli politics representative, and perhaps in a country where you have 2 major political parties and that's it really, it doesn't sound necessary, but I think in Israel it is necessary to be able to allow also the ultra-Orthodox and the Israeli Arabs and various other parts of society to have their voice in political life. That does make the problem of building a coalition. Now, every Israeli prime minister needs a coalition because, like I said, the prime minister doesn't have a mandate. The prime minister Netanyahu could be replaced tomorrow. If 61 members of the Knesset decide that they want a different prime minister, they can tomorrow call for a vote in the Knesset. Netanyahu will no longer be prime minister. Someone else will be the prime minister the moment that he or she has 61, a regular majority of the Knesset voting for them. So the whole time an Israeli prime minister is looking around him and saying, how do I make sure that I'm not going to be kicked out of office? I need to keep hold of my 61. Now, the best way for doing that is trying to balance your coalition, to have parties both on the left of your own party. So an Israeli party has never been big enough to rule on its own. No Israeli party has ever had a majority because of the electoral system. So every Israeli party leader needs to build a coalition around him. The best way for doing that is to have a balance of parties on the right of your party and parties on the left of your party. So Netanyahu would have wanted to have the Zionist Union because that would have balanced the right wing and the ultra-Orthodox parties to his right, who are always coming up with demands. Now, the Zionist Union wouldn't go along with some of what things Netanyahu wanted to do, and Netanyahu promised Herzog that there would be a peace process, and he would meet with Mubarak, and with Sisi, and with King Abdullah, and with Abbas, and go ahead with the peace process. And that was a lie that Netanyahu sold to Herzog. When Herzog realized Netanyahu was lying, he said, I'm not going to go into coalition with you, but it would have been a great coalition for Bibi because it would have balanced. He would have had Likud in the middle, on the right, the far right, and the ultra-Orthodox parties. On the left, he would have Zionist Union. He wouldn't have to worry every day that they could bring him down. Every day, Netanyahu is worried because he's got a small coalition, and if there'll be an indictment, and Eric mentioned the corruption and the investigations against him, Netanyahu could be brought down tomorrow because of the indictments. And if the Attorney General decides, and he may decide very soon, to press charges against Netanyahu and take him to court on these things, Netanyahu will probably lose his majority, and there probably will be 61 Knesset members willing either to vote for early elections or to vote for another prime minister.
I really enjoyed your presentation. I'm here.
Oh, hi.
And, I have two comments. One, that Bibi has survived for such a long period of time because, speaking to friends in Israel for many years, they can point out, after Sharon's death, they can point out to somebody who could provide the level of leadership that Bibi could. Tzipi Livni couldn't, Lapid couldn't, Gabay cannot, and as much as many Israelis in the center are yearning for a centrist government, that a coalition government that would be strong enough to support a consensus, nobody is able to do it, only Bibi. The other comment that I have is that I really think, having read the news for many years, following very carefully and very anxiously what's happening in the little motherland, I really honestly think that Bibi truly believed that Iran is amassing and building up an empire in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and possibly in other locations. Lebanon alone has 166,000 missiles, very accurate missiles pointed at Israel. They can reach any point. I mean, he doesn't have to prove that Iran is building up a bomb. Anybody who reads the intelligence that is confirmed by the West, by the US, by Europe, by European allies, that Israel is in trouble. If Iran establishes bases in the Golan Heights and on the Lebanese border, they can launch an attack that would be very serious and very devastating. And I think that he is focused on the nuclear threat, and maybe he knows something that we don't, and maybe the intelligence community is telling him something we don't know. And maybe he's wrong, and maybe it's a gamble that we'll find out. History will tell who is right, who is wrong on that.
Yep. That's a good comment.
All right, one more question here.
I'm asking the question which I think everybody here has on his or her mind. The ultimate threat to Israel's survival is obviously the demographic one. How does Bibi address the threat to Israel's survival through the explosion of the Palestinian population? That is the issue that all of us are concerned about.
Well, I think Netanyahu believes that if Israel continues as it is today, not to make any concessions to the Palestinians and not to go towards a two-state solution in a real way, not just as a slogan, but actually doing something about it. I think he sincerely believes that the Palestinians will make do with a very limited autonomy, living in enclaves like Gaza, in the West Bank, and so on. And in that, once they make do with that, Israel can somehow manage the situation. And Israel has been managing it for 51 years. And you can look at things that people have written and said 20, 30 years ago, saying the demographic situation is unsustainable, the occupation is unsustainable. it actually has turned out to be sustainable. It's not a good situation. Sorry, it's not a good situation. I don't like the situation. A lot of Israelis don't like it. I think most Israelis would be happy to embrace a two-state situation, but Netanyahu has proven that it's somehow sustainable. And when we talk about the demographic threat, it's always been there. There's always been more or less some kind of a parity between the number of Jews and non-Jews in the area between the Jordan and the Mediterranean. And it hasn't changed to the degree that people try and make it seem it's changed. Just the boundaries have moved a bit. Gaza is it part of the equation? Is it not part of the equation? Are the Palestinians who are Israeli citizens part of the equation? What constitutes a demographic threat? And the actual concept isn't even clear. I think Netanyahu believes he can continue managing, and Israel can continue managing it. I don't think it's manageable for another 100 years. But right now, for the last 51 years, it has, or the last 70 years, depends even how you measure Israel dealing with the demographics, it's somehow worked. It's worked in Israel's favor. It hasn't worked in the Palestinians' favor, but it's worked.
I think we should end.
He's not as wealthy as the U.S. president, but he's in Israeli terms, he's probably worth. He's probably worth about $10 million. Is that? Does that make him wealthy? And in my book as well, but in my book certainly. But he's probably not more wealthy than most heads of state around the world. I think most heads of state probably have amassed more wealth than he has, but it's all relative.
All right, sir, the very last question.
The Israeli the Jewish population has been outgrowing the Arab population. So we don't know how the demographics will handle. But my question,
it's changing all the time.
Well, that's at least good news. If in fact,
whether it's good news or bad news, I think the question is not a question of numbers. The question is a question of values. What values Israel wants to have, not how many Palestinians there are.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Was about the fence. This Friday is supposed to be the culmination. It isn't a question about Bibi, but it's growing in intensity, and we don't know if, in fact, Iran might add into that. We don't know if there could be protesters coming down from Syria, from Lebanon, even the West Bank. Any thoughts about what's going to happen?
Well, there'll certainly be a lot of protests this Friday and next week on the 15th, which is Nakba Day, and it's the 70th anniversary of Nakba Day. But despite the attention that it's got in some parts of the media, it hasn't worked for Hamas or for the Palestinians, because it's true, it's grown in intensity, but it's shrunk in numbers. 6 weeks ago, the first Friday of the protests, there were 41,000. This weekend, it was 7,000 or 8,000, and the graph is going down and down. So these are very intense outbreaks of violence, but they haven't achieved anything in the sense that the world the media maybe, parts of the media, but the world's not paying attention. Certainly the U.S. administration isn't going to do anything about it. They've given basically blanket cover to whatever Israel's doing. The Europeans not very happy with the situation, but they haven't done anything. So I can predict, I hate to be predicted, but people will be killed. 50 people have been killed already in this series of demonstrations. People will be killed. There'll be some kind of attack on the fence, and maybe they'll pull down part of the fence around Gaza. They'll be pushed back, more people will be killed, and it'll be over. And it's a very dismal state of affairs, but I don't think it's going to have a long-term effect.
I think it's going to be worse than that.
Well,
All right.
I hope we're all
Anshel and Eric, thank you very much for a fascinating conversation. I want to encourage everyone to go over and buy a book.